The Bending Toward Justice exhibit space developed through the Riches Digital Archiving Project as a way to utilize and add to the collections we have developed and present the material in an interactive exhibit that tells the stories of Black communities in Central Florida. Collecting data and developing the exhibits depends on our partnerships with Black communities that we have developed over the last 10 years and on the work of student interns and class projects. Let me tell you about our mission. We developed our mission statement, which I will read to you. The arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. Words spoken by Theodore Parker, an abolitionist minister in 1853. Martin Luther King Jr. modified the quote to say, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. The quote in either form can be interpreted to mean that a passive wait for justice will eventually lead to equal political or social status, or that those in positions of power will eventually confer such status. The Bending Toward Justice digital exhibit project builds on a different interpretation. The exhibits planned and presented in this digital space document the ways in which Blacks in Central Florida bent the arc toward justice through their everyday lives and under extraordinary conditions. We have three goals in the project. First, we want the project to conform to the historiography of the Black experience in the South, so it is a scholarly exhibit. Second, we are engaged with the Black community in Central Florida to document and preserve life in the period from 1863 to the present. And third, we are creating digital exhibits on the Black community that are accessible to multiple audiences, ranging from general audiences to students and scholars, using mapping, interactive visualizations, oral histories, and personal images and artifacts gathered through history harvests. There will be multiple exhibits in this exhibit space, and they come through Rich's connections with Black communities. That has facilitated the research, the planning, and the development of 3 exhibits that we're working on at the moment. They are in various stages of completion. The first one that we'll be talking more about today is called Voting Rights and Voter Suppression. The second exhibit, which is actually the exhibit that we first began to work on, is called Black Capitalism, and it looks at Black businessmen and entrepreneurs in the 20th century in 3 communities at the moment, but we expect it to go on and include additional communities. So the communities we have looked at are Paramore and Hannibal Square, and we are just beginning a project with Georgetown in Sanford. The third exhibit that we're working on, and again, we're at the very early stages of this one, is an exhibit on Black schools. We have started working with Oviedo on that project, and we are in conversations with COCO about a second project. There are future exhibits that we have planned, and they include an exhibit on religion to document Black churches in the area. We are beginning an oral history exhibit, which we're doing our first oral history on the 4th of October. And the name of that exhibit space will be This Is My Story. Another exhibit that we're contemplating is one on civil rights in Central Florida. And finally, we have spoken with the Florida Prison Education Project to do an exhibit on Black incarceration. So we have long-term projects planned for this exhibit space, and I hope you will work with us to make those projects happen. Let's talk about the Voting Rights and Voter Suppression project. It looks at Ocoee from 1920 to 2020. And we came into that project kind of as it developed. It was not a project we had anticipated doing, but as the community around us began to plan for the Ocoee commemoration, the 100th year commemoration, they began to approach us to house artifacts, to house images, to house video, and to help them collect oral histories. And as we did that, we began to think about perhaps we should add something to this commemorative process as well. As academics, there's a view of Ocoee that we would take that others might not take. As every public historian knows, researching and presenting difficult history is always a challenge. Researching and presenting difficult history in the county in which the subject event occurred during the 100th anniversary and under the conditions of a pandemic, racial unrest, and a contentious election created unique challenges and a sense of deja vu. So how did we approach this project, and what were our conceptual frameworks for it? We divided the exhibit into 3 phases. And the first phase, which opened in July 2021, looks at Ocoee as a case study and places Ocoee in the larger state and national context so that we can see Ocoee not only as a local event, but as part of a continuum of events that took place in African-American life in this period. The second phase of the exhibit, which will open at the end of this month, is a brief history of voting rights and voter suppression, focusing on the challenges Black voters faced and continue to encounter. And the third part of the exhibit, commemorating Ocoee 100 years later, allows us to look at how Orange County and Central Florida engaged with the Ocoee massacre. And that will include the links to newspaper articles, to documentary films, to podcasts and blogs, to community events, to art exhibits and history exhibits that took place. And perhaps most unique to this, to the things that happened in Central Florida, we have a documentary film from the Orlando Magic of their efforts to get out the vote in the 2020 election. Perhaps you would want to know also about the Bending Toward Justice team. We have a multi-disciplined team to make this happen. So myself and Dr. Gordon are the historians, and we consulted with a team of scholars and museum advisors to help us as we conceptualize this exhibit. We have an important tech team, Dr. Amy Giroux and Dr. Mike Shire from the Center for Humanities and Digital Research, and the Riches tech team, Kirk Lundblade and Jeff Crivero. Kayla Campagna kept all of our correspondence for us. She obtained the permissions for images, and she maintained the bibliography. When we release the third phase of the exhibit, we will also include that bibliography, which is quite extensive. Tiffany Rivera was so valuable to us. She did the community outreach and the marketing of this exhibit, and it was through her efforts that we actually got the Orlando Magic to help us with our exhibit. We had numerous graduate students and undergraduates who served as interns on this project. And as interns, they were a vital part of the project. They attended workshops, they made public presentations, they researched land deeds, they found images for us, they wrote text, They helped with the editing on the project, and we owe them a deep debt of gratitude. They included Sophie Barrett, Anna Kephart, Sabrina Sawney, Maria Julia Cabrera, Eamon Quinn, and Rhiannon O'Neill. And we thank them for all the work they did. Right before the pandemic broke out, Dr. Gordon and I made a research trip. And it was lucky that we did it at the time we did it. We did it in the fall of 2019, and thankfully we did it. So we owe debts of gratitude to various university archives, UCF Special Collections, and the archives of the University of Florida, Tuskegee University in Alabama, and Bethune-Cookman University. We consulted with a number and searched the archives of a number of museums, local museums, and archives. And among the museums we consulted with was the Winter Garden Heritage Foundation, and I will tell you they have a jewel of an archive. They helped us enormously in finding images to use in the exhibit. The Orange County Regional's History Center was likewise very helpful to us. We visited the Florida State Archives, and we used their digital archives, the Florida Memory, as well. We worked with the National Archive, and I think Kayla got to be on a first name basis with them. And they suggested materials for us. And we worked with the Smithsonian as well. We're also grateful to the NAACP for their assistance on this project. And finally, I'll address what's next. This is an exhibit that is a living exhibit, and we expect to add to it periodically as new information becomes available. The next thing we know we will be adding to it will come in the spring. The Florida Historical Quarterly will publish in volume 100, number 4, in spring 2022, a special issue on remembering Ocoee. 4 scholars will provide articles in which they assess what happened in 2020 and how the community commemorated the Ocoee massacre. And each of those articles will be added to the exhibit once they've been published. So I'll turn this over to Jeff Cravero now.
Good afternoon. So one of the benefits to presenting our research digitally is that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Oftentimes the story has already been told effectively, and all we need to do is link to another website or page. They've already done it well, so we allow them to tell the story. This might be a podcast, video documentary, website, maybe another digital exhibit, something like that. This is easier to do in a digital format than a traditional text format, where the best you can do is cite them in a footnote and hope they maybe look it up on their own. So long as you're giving proper citation and credit for their work, the digital exhibit can benefit by including links to other projects in order to tell the story more effectively. And just like research published in text, ensuring that copyrights and citations are correct is a crucial aspect to digital exhibitions. In the case of our project, we've incorporated dozens of images, text, maps, charts, videos, and we've made hundreds of references to other sources. A major consideration when selecting these images and materials is it public domain? If not, who owns the copyright and can we obtain permission to use it? These are often behind a paywall, so sometimes we have to consider if the cost is worth it and if it's even feasible within our budget. Public databases such as the Library of Congress and Florida Memory, which is run by the State of Florida Archives, are 2 sources we often use to find open source material. Another consideration in selecting an image, chart, map, something of that nature is, does it convey the intended message, and what sort of an impact does it make? The use of imagery can help break up large blocks of text, but if they don't help convey the message effectively, they can be counterintuitive or confusing to the reader. So you want to find material that will complement your research. When we're gathering research for digital exhibits, that can offer its own challenges as well. In addition to some of the traditional research methods, such as visiting archives, books, newspapers, journal articles, an effective way to attain information is by reaching out to community members. Building trust with these community members, especially regarding sensitive topics such as this, can be a challenge in of itself. Oftentimes, communities are guarded, and for good reasons. Many have been burned before in the past. There's a level of distrust when outside forces come asking questions. Once you're able to convince people that you're going to present their story honestly and in good faith, other opportunities might begin to open up. In our case, we began working with groups such as the Alliance for Truth and Justice, which is an organization that advocates community education and justice for those victimized by inequities born of prejudice, whose project is rooted in acknowledging the Ocoee massacre and the violence committed in the name of white supremacy. Developing a rapport with them opened doors for us that led to some fantastic oral history interviews. One of the interviews I conducted was with Mr. Robert Hickey, who is the grandson of an Ocoee family, who, according to him, lost more property after the Ocoee massacre than did any other family in the community. Mr. Hickey shared personal stories and painful details in his oral history interview that he might not have had we not established ourselves in our project and aligned with others in the community who were doing good faith work as well. He also sent us personal photographs of his grandparents and him as a young man, and photographs of his grandparents' tombstone, which he recently refurbished. These stories were family secrets of sorts that understandably have been kept private for all these years, but these ended up being an integral part of our exhibit. We used direct quotes in several sections, we used the photographs he sent, and we linked to the full interview on our YouTube channel. Again, this is another benefit to presenting our research digitally. You wouldn't be able to bring readers directly to a video of an oral history you conducted in a book or a journal article. Again, it's a way of telling the story more effectively. As with many group projects, organization, communication, and focus are things that need to be effectively implemented in order to keep it moving forward. We use Microsoft Teams. We have weekly meetings, at first in person and then through Zoom. In Teams, we've organized folders where we can all submit our research as we go, and we have spreadsheets to keep track of what is being worked on by whom. This is also a helpful resource for our students who have been working with us over a period of several semesters. They can see what we've accomplished and what needs attention. It allows us to clearly define expectations and deadlines. Perhaps one of the greatest challenges in presenting this type of work to a general public is dealing with historians who love their text and how to present your research in a manner that isn't wordy or too text heavy. We need to be brief and to the point, or people might quickly tune out. This is a common challenge for public historians. As I mentioned earlier, we break up text blocks using images, maps, or something like that. Some other tactics we've developed we began using are by allowing users to click a read more option. So the first paragraph or two will be visible and concisely summarize the information we'd like to convey. And then the reader has the option to click a read more option where several more paragraphs of information are hidden. This is where we can go into more detail and provide more context to those that are interested without losing those that might not be. We also use this tactic for things like transcriptions of documents, handwritten letters, newspaper articles that might not be completely legible. We have an extensive list, for example, of Supreme Court cases with short summaries regarding redistricting and gerrymandering that you can access by clicking that option. Otherwise, viewers would be lost in a sea of text that just would go on and on. We also consider how to present information in interesting and new ways, whether it's interactive or visually stimulating, something like that. A couple of examples are when dealing with redistricting, we have a map of Florida's history of redistricting where you can click by year. Every 10 years, based on new census data, districts are redrawn, and viewers can see the districts shifting and shrinking and changing over time. They can also zoom in and out of the map to explore the details of the districts. We've also created a word cloud of newspaper headlines about the Ocoee massacre. The words that appear most are the largest ones. Users can hover over the word cloud and words become highlighted and stand out. Again, just another interesting way of presenting your research that you wouldn't be able to do in traditional forms, which are much more limited. So let's see. Now I am going to hand it over to Kirk, who can offer his perspective in working with us text-loving historians on a project such as this. And he'll tell you some more about the back-end work that goes into a digital exhibit. And if you'll please give us just a moment to make an audio adjustment.
All right, Jeff, cue me in, give me a thumbs up when I'm ready to go. Okay. All right, everyone. So my name is Kirk Klumblade. I'm the applications engineer with the Riches team. That means effectively I am the software engineer who is tasked with sort of bringing this project to fruition, as it were, and dealing with a lot of the pragmatic details. So let's see. Hold on, Zoom is misbehaving. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit, starting point here on doing history on the web. So what does that mean? So we're going to start academic and get down into some of the details that I've had to work with. Starting point for any digital project, we have to consider specifically what it means to do scholarly history on the web. And in effect, what we're asking is a question that's been asked in many times in many related contexts. What are the strengths and weaknesses, the affordances, we might say, of the medium? And how does that affect exhibiting history? So Marshall McLuhan's famous aphorism might be a bit dramatic, but it forms a useful starting point when translating or conducting familiar work, scholarly history, in a new media context. So in this case, on the web. Because this is a design project, the argument doesn't stay at the level of medium or form and isn't conducted in an academic journal, but it must be applied to all of our design decisions, all the way down to the code itself, to some of the writing, code I'm writing on a daily basis. It's an iterative, kind of messy process that begins with the form and spins out into discussions of everything from paragraph size and font colors to software versioning and load times. Jeff has talked about some of these. So there are a couple core strengths and weaknesses, some benefits and some challenges that I want to go ahead and highlight here. In our project, of course, we try to take advantage of the strengths where we can, and considerable time and energy is spent figuring how we can sort of mitigate some of the weaknesses. And again, some of these Jeff has already addressed, so I'm going to stick with a couple of them here. So first is the collaborative capacity. Everyone here is doubtless familiar with these tools, with Google Docs, with Teams, with Slack, with Zoom. They've enabled most of us to continue organizationally functioning over the past 2 years. That's not quite enough when you're doing a web-based project like this. Because as it turns out, even in phase one, even at the very beginning, phase one of a multi-exhibit site, we're dealing with a lot of content, a lot of text. 20,000 words is the slimmed down version of that first phase. And if you are just editing that in a document, fine. That can happen pretty quickly. But when you have to turn that into a web page and you need to be able to make changes to that web page, reformat, adjust, etc., you need some sort of platform, some sort of content management system. So clearly, we're using WordPress here. We didn't start this way, but this wound up being fairly cliche, but the quick and easiest and by far the most effective way to allow our team to work together and allow me to set things up so that the technical side kind of gets out of everyone else's way. So another important factor, important aspect is intertextuality and nonlinearity. So when I talk about this, what I'm referring to, intertextuality refers to the web part of the World Wide Web. That's that ability to build in accessible relations to outside materials. Jeff is right, it's really important that we're able to build this into a sort of a multimedia project, and not just a multimedia project, but a multimedia project where some of the work has been conducted, already done by outside sources, by other scholarly groups, other stakeholders, and we don't have to reinvent the wheel, we just link out to that. Nonlinearity refers to the ability of web tools and materials to facilitate a sort of complex, dynamic traversal and narrative construction. What you see here is a story map for a tool called Twine that allows you to build interactive narrative. It could very easily function as a map for navigating a website, although this would probably be a poor design for a website. This is the sort of affordance that digital systems share with games, so very common for my own research. And in both of these cases, this is a property which historians have kind of fixated upon when doing history in digital spaces. So put simply, what happens when academic history, which is traditionally constructed in linear narrative form, is positioned to take advantage of these properties. Not only what is gained, but what is lost, and how might that material be misconstrued willfully or otherwise by the audience is an important concern. So in our case, we took advantage of kind of split the difference on this nonlinearity, and we went with what in information architecture is called an orthogonal mode of access. So simply just building in multiple ways to navigate the site. The most obvious, which is just so banal, it needs no explanation, is just having a menu that allows people to move to any part of the exhibit that they want. And that's paired with a more traditional a structure that kind of harkens back to a more linear narrative that allows people to instead just step through and read it like chapters in a book. Very, very simple techniques that allow us to kind of split the difference on some of these affordances. So another important concern is ephemerality. So we have our site here. It looks great. It looks wonderful. It's been up for however many months. Time is a strange construct in pandemic days. What we worry about is it turning into this. So you might have heard of link rot, which is a term for the rate at which hyperlinks decay. They wind up pointing to non-existent resources on the web. Any of us who have ever done online research and you've tried to track down an article or something an article linked to, you've run into this at some point. The link, the ultimate source you're looking for, or one of the links along the way, no longer exists. So an old study from 2003 found that web links have a half-life of 138 weeks. That's 2.5 years or so, and that was in 2003. So in 2021, there's a great deal of circumstantial evidence which suggests that this rate is in fact much higher. This is a problem for web developers, this is a problem for me broadly, but it's also a problem for historians in particular when they're doing the archival side of this work. So consider the case of 9/11 footage. We just had the 20th anniversary of 9/11, and I don't know about you, but I didn't see a great deal of the original footage shown. There are likely several good reasons for this, but a major contributing one is that the footage in question is simply no longer accessible. Adobe, which is a company platform that you may be familiar with, recently ended their support for Flash, which those of us who are around on the internet in the earlier years will probably remember. And that has effectively shuttered and completely closed off a massive section of a source of internet material, of videos in particular. So content on the web is intertextual and interactive, and it's great being able to link out to these other sources and connect and integrate other people's work. Yes, but the ephemerality of the web means that project designers must contend with not only the entropy of their own project, so all of the tools and systems that must be updated within the site that you're building, but also the entropy of any materials they reference, they link out to or build, heavens forbid, into the foundation of their web application. So this gets us to one of the classic buzzwords for digital projects, which is sustainability. How will your project be maintained over time? How will you handle the collapse of platforms and scripts used to build your site? How will you handle the loss of links and outside reference in your text? and how you handle the inevitable decay of the physical infrastructure your site is run on. All of these things have to be considered. We're going from a very high level in the OSI model in sort of a web reference stack, all the way down to the most fundamental and basic, is the hard drive that the server is streaming from in the server, is that going to fail? All of these things have to be taken into account. So in our case, there are many, many strategies we went through, and I'm just trying to touch briefly. For handling links, for handling the case of link rot, an important concern was to make sure that when we link out to outside material, that material isn't making our argument for us, that material is supplementary to what we are trying to do. So in the event that that link fails or that site gets shuttered or taken down, there isn't a serious gap in the exhibit where the argument falls through, the narrative falls through. It can augment what we are already trying to do and usually does so, but in the event that it fails and we don't catch it with a link audit in time, someone who experiences or visits the site during that time isn't going to have a noticeably jarring experience. Again, this is a mitigation strategy, and there's still, you're going to have minor issues here and there, but that's just one that we've gone ahead and done for that. Now, for broadly more speaking, when we're dealing with sustainability, I had two major approaches to addressing the sustainability of BTJ. One is a sort of minimalist modular design for the software engineers and for the programmer folks in the room. Basically, I'm attempting to ensure that we have as few breaking critical dependencies as possible. Basically, there will be little parts of the site that use plugins and use other applications and tools. But if those fail, I have tried very hard to select and build in the way so that it won't take down the whole site and the damage can be contained, so to speak. That's very, very hard to do well. And obviously there are some risks and still some issues, but more or less I've tried to go with that minimalist approach. And you can see this sort of bubbles up, percolates up into the visual components of the site. It tends to have a very streamlined design that also, I argue, works and translates well to mobile, but that's partially an artifact of the modular component-driven approach that we've taken to it. On the documentation side, there is a great deal of documentation that goes into a project like this. So Jeff broached the subject of sort of metadata and documenting and getting permissions and collecting information on all of the images and materials we've been using, which is a huge amount of work. But along with that, there's also documentation for the code itself. I am only one person, and if I were to get sick or something were to happen, then some other engineer, some other person here would need to be able to step in and try and ensure the continuity of the project. And in order to do that, they need to do the sort of notoriously tricky task of understanding someone else's code. So that means in my level, I went in and I've tried very hard as I've designed and extended this to ensure that at every level the code is documented so that someone reading through it knows what I was trying to do, knows what this part of the application does. Unfortunately, in the broad scheme of web applications, speaking on a software side, this is not nearly, it's minimally complex. So the work here is not as insurmountable as it might be if we were, trying to document Google. But nonetheless, it's an important part of the process. And that gets us through my time here. I could kind of go on for longer, but got a limited time slot. Y'all got places to be. So I will hand this off to, I believe Dr. Gordon is next. Can't hear anything, so.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Right, bending toward justice, documenting the struggle for civil rights, historiography. That is my subject today, historiography and the Ocoee massacre in 1920. The Ocoee Massacre took place in Western Orange County on November 2nd and 3rd, 1920, and is central to the historiography of the American South, the state of Florida, and the nation. Historian of the New South, Edward Ayers, noted that an important essay collection that was published in 2000, that was Jumping Jim Crow, Southern Politics from Civil War to Civil Rights. One of the reasons that historian Ayers thought the work was important was because it expanded the boundaries of traditional Southern political history. So the Bending Toward Justice team has engaged the centennial of the Ocoee Massacre to create, as Dr. Lester said, a multi-level digital exhibit and archive that builds on community and academic partnerships through RICHES, Regional Initiative for Collecting History, Experiences, and Stories. The Bending Toward Justice team has also read the Ocoee Massacre as a case study of New South power relations that re-examines the boundaries and narratives of earlier interpretations. The success of radical Reconstruction after the Civil War included the Reconstruction Amendments. The 13th Amendment abolished the institution of slavery, except as punishment for crime. The 14th Amendment enabled birthright citizenship, and the 15th Amendment enabled Black male suffrage. But as C. Van Woodward observed in his The Burden of Southern History in 1960, equality was a far more revolutionary aim than freedom. The political redemption of unreconstructed Southern Democrats after the Compromise of 1877 invalidated Black citizenship and suffrage. Indeed, white supremacy required the violation of Black rights. The prevalent form of anti-Black violence and race-making at the center of the Ocoee Massacre was a strategy for voter suppression in the form of lynching and the massacre as a form of anti-Black violence as well. From the late 19th century, Ida B. Wells was the most prominent voice of protest against American and Southern lynching in the late 19th century. She published Southern Horrors in 1892, and The Red Record was a compendium of statistics of United States lynchings in the last decade of the 19th century. In both texts, Wells critically dismantled the fiction that the rape of white women was justification for lynching. She suggested, nobody in this section of the country believes the old threadbare lie that Negro men rape white women. Wells argued that in addition to the lie of rape, other justifications for lynching included the need to repress race riots, the refusal of white Southerners to admit the legitimacy of Black civil rights, and the demand for white men's government or white supremacy. In addition to Ida B. Wells, the Chicago Tribune in 1882 began tracking and publishing the lynching numbers each January for the previous year. In the same year, 1881, Tuskegee Institute also began counting the number of lynchings in the nation. In 1919, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, published 30 years of lynching in the United States from 1889 to 1918. More recently, in the 21st century, the Equal Justice Initiative, founded at Montgomery, Alabama in 1989, has published an annual report, Lynching in America, Confronting the Legacy of Racial Terror. The new compilation has added at least 700 more lynchings than previously counted. EJI is also responsible for the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which opened in April of 2018. As Dr. Lester mentioned earlier when she was speaking, she and I visited the EJI Legacy Museum and the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in December of 2019, before the pandemic. In a chapter entitled The Age of Segregation, historian George Brown Tyndall declared that the Red Summer of 1919, in which there were at least 25 race riots and massacres, He declared that the largest riot in 1920 was caused by Negro efforts to vote in Ocoee, Florida. Dr. Tyndall concluded that there were two salient facts about post-World War I race rioting. The first, that the lynching phenomenon was no longer confined to the South, and the second was a spirit of resistance and retaliation among African Americans. The defiance, or rather W.E.B. Du Bois, reified the defiance that Tyndall remarked when, as editor of the Crisis magazine, the official monthly publication of the NAACP, Du Bois wrote in May 1919, we return from fighting. We return fighting. Make way for democracy. We saved it in France, and by the great Jehovah, we will save it in the United States of America, or know the reason why. In her study of segregation in the New South, historian Grace Elizabeth Hale, in Making Whiteness, The Culture of Segregation in the South, 1890 to 1940, recounted the process of lynching modernization. This process included the use of trains and automobiles to transport as many people as possible to lynching venues, and wielding cars as weapons to drag and otherwise mutilate the Black body, or to parade a victim before the denouement. In addition, radios, telephones, and cameras provided mass communication about the proceedings, as well as postcards, audio recordings, and film that reproduced the events. Hale asserted that the 1893 lynching of Henry Smith in Paris, Texas, was the founding event in the history of spectacle lynchings. The venue was public, promoted with a chartered excursion train, vendors sold commemorative photographs, and a souvenir pamphlet described the ordeal. The number of New South era studies of race massacres has increased in the 21st century. Some of these titles include Tim Madigan's The Burning, Massacre, Destruction, and the Tulsa Race Riot of 1921, Robert Whittaker on The Lapse of Gods, The Red Summer of 1919, and the Struggle for Justice That Remade a Nation, and Cameron McWhirter, Red Summer, The Summer of 1919 and the Awakening of Black America. Historian David F. Krugler reiterated the concern of Ida B. Wells that the use of language has been an important part of the process of making and examining anti-Black violence. Krugler suggested that the term race riot implies that Black Americans participated in or were equally responsible for the violence. He explained that his use of the term race riot was a synonym for anti-Black collective violence. Riot also conjures spontaneity, but anti-Black collective violence was deliberate and methodical. He argued that African-American resistance and self-defense was an appropriate and legitimate response. Krugler considered American pogrom also as an accurate identification of massacres, of racial massacres. An important study as well is Philip Dray's At the Hands of Persons Unknown, The Lynching of Black America. Finally, the classic text by Darlene Clark Hine, Black Victory, The Rise and Fall of the White Primary in Texas, published in 1979 and reissued in 2003, helped shape the Bending Toward Justice voter suppression narrative. The increase in Black voter registration in response to the demise of the Democratic Party white primary across the state contributed to the success of the mid-20th century civil rights movement. So in keeping with historian Edward Ayer's admonition to expand the boundaries of political interpretation, Bending Toward Justice has posed several questions. Does the nation bear responsibility for the Ocoee massacre? Another question, was the consumption of Black bodies in lynching rituals and massacres an echo or memory of the circulation and fetish of Black bodies in the internal domestic slave trade of the antebellum era? These are questions for consideration. Thank you.
And since we're muted, we'll need someone to cue us over here.
Thank you, Dr. Gordon. We will now take questions from our virtual audience. If you have a question, will you please raise your hand so that we can call on you?
We must have.
Again, if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand and we will be glad to call on you.
Well, while we're waiting for questions, I would invite you to go to our website and to see that first exhibit and to give us some feedback on the exhibit. One of the beauties of having a digital exhibit is that, you know, if you've made a spelling error, you can change it. and we welcome your ideas about what we've done and what you think about the exhibit. You can go to bendingtowardjustice.cah.ucf.edu to see the first phase of the exhibit and very shortly the second phase as well. Okay, if we don't have questions, then we'll assume we've answered all of your questions about the exhibit. And we appreciate you joining us today. And I would invite you, if you're a student, to consider becoming an intern with Riches and with Bending Toward Justice, because as I indicated, we still have lots of things to do. And we would love to have you join us to help us create the next exhibits that we're working on. Thank you very much.